Okay, so you can start now. And hi, everybody, and welcome to this new medium, the Finance Online seminars. And today, our guests are Constantin Parvulescu and Alasdair King, and they will talk about the relation between finance and cinema. It's a fascinating subject and very interesting subject. And Constantin is also the editor of a very interesting book, Global Finance Screen. And so I think that he is one of the best people to talk about finance and cinema, and that's why I have invited him. And I just will I remind you of the format of the meeting. So Constantin will talk for about 45 minutes. And then Alasdair will give a speech for about 10 minutes, and then we can open the debate. So I would like to thank you very much, Constantin and Alasdair, for being here today. And that's all from me. I give the word to Constantin, so he can share his slides with us.
Can't hear you, Constantine. You have to unmute.
Right. Thank you. All right. So I was actually talking about you. I want to say that we also have a contributor to the collection, and that is Michael Shannon. And of course, he has a great perspective on finance film as well, because he has made a documentary, Money Puzzles, and he writes in the end by almost like a postface to the volume and from the filmmaker's perspective. And I also had the pleasure in a different article to write about Money Puzzles and its interesting insights on the way in which we envision money and finance. So thank you very much for participating, Michael. And also thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much, Dr. King, for participating, also a future author of a book. So we are in a very competitive context here. I will share my slides now. So the title of the presentation, as you can see, is called The Afterlives of Finance Film in the Digital Public Sphere. And my story is pretty simple. There is an archive of films, and you can see them here. Most of it made in the post-2008 era, which is also the year of the Great Recession. This archive had a strong impact in the public sphere in its days. This impact is changing and it is diminishing. The content and the message of the films is being reinterpreted, and this is time is a factor, obviously. There is so let's say a semantic entropy that is at work here. We also have, but there are other factors, and somehow my presentation will reflect on these factors, and one of them is curation, and curation in the digital sphere in particular here. And one aspect of this transformation, of this curation and the way in which, let's say, this is also that the archive is being reinterpreted. And I will point out, a few actors or a few culprits that are, let's say, responsible for these transformations of the way in which we interpret these films. And finally, we will together. I mean, I don't really have a silver bullet and a complete answer here, but we also will reflect on the effects on viewing and on the public sphere, though this is, of course, a huge topic, and I cannot cover it here, but at least insights on curation can give us, the curation of this archive of finance films can give us some insights into in which they are impacting the public sphere presently. As said, you are familiar obviously with these films. So from The Big Short to Inside Job with Capital and so on, there's of course a long list of them made, as said, after 2008. There are of course some made before, but I think this archive became very consistent after 2008. The archive is being expanded, but not at the same speed as before. You can see we have movies also made not only in the United States, as most of them were before, but also in Europe, also like not only films, but also television series. So this is a German television series here, Bad Banks. This is a Swedish television series, and a British film, most recently released. And what we see here is that what I argue in a way is that this archive, on the one hand, tries to speak to a more specialist audience, and on the other hand, as I will show, it also tries to seek audiences along genre lines, along other, let's say, tags that are not specific to what we call here specific to the archive of finance film. And the reason that this archive is shrinking is perhaps given here in this slide. So as you can see, Capitalism, a Love Story is a documentary. Inside Job is a documentary. The Nest is a feature film starring, with having a pretty well-known cast. So Jude Law as a playing the protagonist. And you can see I'm not interested in the money. I'm interested that the money also reflects audiences. And while a film from 2009 grossed this amount of money, as we go in time to a film like The Nest, of course you can say, well, the one was more popular, one was better made, the other one was less better made, but The Nest, is still distributed by HBO, and you can see that the figures are significantly slower. And again, we're comparing a documentary which has a more limited audience with a feature film. So okay, so in the post-recession era, I think the audience of this archive is shrinking. Now, I was talking about this archive, and perhaps I should say a few things about it. Of course, because this collection that I edited is on the poster of the presentation, I will also say just a few words about it. I mean, it was an effort at the time of its making to define this archive, describe its characteristics, and one of the important aspects that I think was a consensus among all the participants, I mean, we had a conference before, and then the editing of the book, was that finance film should be defined, even if we use genre as to define it, whether we talk about Wall Street, whether we talk finance film, whether we talk about crisis film, 2008 crisis film, the critical intervention should be an important aspect, an important tagging of the archive. Yeah, so critical intervention of also. On the other hand, film regarded as public art, as participating in an act of empowerment and of creation of wise publics. Of course, critical intervention is one concept among many others. So you can see also people, Dr. King here used performativity in line with Judy Butler's theories, Toscano and Kinkel, who also wrote a book about film and crisis. They use cognitive mappings, more on a Jamesonian Frederick Jameson line of thought, and Marike de Goede, who comes from social sciences, used critical visualizations, but pretty much everybody thinks of finance films as, empowering, stimulating dialogue, mobilizing, and I would say profaning. I would not elaborate on this, but this is somehow I put it here because this is my line of thought and the way in which I want to move on. I want to continue researching the archive, and that will be profanation as defined by Giorgio Agamben in the book with the same title, published, as I noticed, like in Rome and in no other place. I have a couple of slides at the end. If you want, we can talk about this concept. But now the whole point is that I want to emphasize again, that we think of finance in the Wall Street film as a critical intervention. And in a way, this is a bit the problem that's happening with the archive as time goes by. And is not necessarily happening in other genres of film. So for example, you think of war film or the Vietnam War film, it still has its anti-war critical edge, even 10, 20, 30 years after their making. And to give an example on the way in which this critical intervention is being, let's say, loses its edge, I will give you an example of from on the left-hand side. You have recession era reviews on my left-hand side, or I hope it's not in the mirror. And on the right-hand side, there's comments on The Big Short in present-day curation of the film. And I will explain what I mean. So by the time of its release, 2015, end of let's say, of the Great Recession, like influential blogs and newspapers in the United States, and I think it's worth quoting, talked about the film as showing the murky process by which a housing market bubble somehow turned into a global financial catastrophe. The New York Times called it a crime story that will affirm your deepest cynicism about Wall Street. The San Francisco Chronicle talked about the film as revealing investment banking biggest secret, its colossal and contemptible stupidity, right? Which is one of I think, the strong arguments of the film. Now, in present-day curation, which is done by specific media, and I will return and talk more about this media, but for example, on aggregators such as Investopedia, it talks about the film in a different way. And I think just by giving the example, you can also already tell the difference and notice the contrast. So Investopedia, very well-known information aggregator and simplifier, talks about The Big Short, as a film presenting brokers who saw an opportunity to profit by betting against the real estate market. So no longer the critical aspect. And 300 Hours also similarly, it is an entertaining film, great at explaining often dry and technical details of financial instruments, such as the origination and complexity of synthetic CDOs, in a scene where Selena Gomez, the famous musician, plays a blackjack. Wouldn't it be nice if CFA program, CFA is the certificates that broker get in the United States, wouldn't it be nice if CFC program material was explained like this, right? So I would not yet draw the conclusions, but I think you already have, you understand which way I'm going, okay? So that the archive and is being reinterpreted, and I can tell you, because I've researched this aspect, it happens to most of the films or all of the films that are being juggled on these type of curators online these days, like Investopedia, 300 Hours, and many more. And I will give you examples later. All right. Good. So then it comes a bit of it in to my thesis. So okay, the curation of the archive on the one hand. So you have more titles here on the left. So the curation of the archive on the other helps understand how finance film is presently approached and by whom. The creation of the archive gestures toward cultural practices of positivization. I think this is an important aspect, which is another way of saying that the critical edge is being rendered less sharp. So gestures toward practices of positivation and instrumentalization of critical interventions, and I will come back to this concept as well. That also then generating the archive is I'm showing that the archive is administered by interested actors. Of course, the conclusion would be that commercial interests inform the way we have access to the archive and interpret its content. So this is very important because the act of curating, of course, influences the way in which we interact with these films presently. And I hope what comes next will clarify all these statements. All right, so as said, I will come back when I mentioned Investopedia, when I mentioned 300 hours, these were what I think are the most influential curators of this archive today, or administrators, if you want to use this concept, okay? So on the one hand, we have, so here on the right hand side, so there are listed, I think, the most important of them. First of all, there are producers of film, right? Like the producers of The Nest. These are economic actors that they make and market new films. And by the way in which they market new films, by the way in which they are designed, their focus, and on and so forth, it influences the way in which the archive is being rearranged and it's being approached. So producers on the one hand, then we have digital streamers and vendors like of Netflix streamers and HBO, the streamer of what I gave you the example. Netflix shows The Big Short and The Wolf of Wall Street. So these will be on the streamers, and on the other hand, I mean, Amazon is a streamer, but first of all, it is a vendor, right? So the people who sell films. We do have then another administrator of the archive, which is Google, and any other search engines. So for example, Google, the one that we usually use. Then we have, and this is the category of Investopedia and 300 Hours and many others. So aggregators, blogs, also various investment portals that have kind of public creation sites, and they generate what usually is being accessed through the Google searches, and that is the must-see list, the best finance films of all time, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's us, activists, cinephiles, academic critics, and so on. And of course, we tend to, I hope, I mean, there are, of course, people who teach business ethics and people who perhaps have a more positive attitude towards finance than, let's say, anyway, so we try to emphasize what I was mentioning before, the critical intervention of film and interpreting it as public art. So as you can notice here, almost all of them, perhaps even us, the academics and the critics sometimes, are economically driven, and the curation is economically driven. Good. So let's now, what I propose now is to go and talk about each of them. So producers, digital streamers, search engines, aggregators, and if you don't mind, I will skip ourselves, and because as academics, we always tend to talk too much about ourselves. So I will skip that part because that is less, we don't have to criticize it now. So producers, okay, so producers, what I argue is that many of them make less critical films on the one hand, or they make films that are being sold along other tags, not the critical intervention that I was talking about. So the example that I give here is of this recent production, The Nest, starring Jude Law, directed by Alasdair King, 2021. I'm not sure if you saw it or not. Well, not a fantastic film, but you know, it has at least it claims to be a film that reflects on something related to finance and to, let's say, the corporate culture of, however, of the 1980s. And if I were to, let's say, write a paper on The Nest, what I would emphasize is the way in which it is framed along softer genre lines to reach broader audiences. That is not so much as we talked about finance film in the collection, not so much the critical edge, not so much a corporate crime film, not with a documentarist or kind of, you know, indexical intention to generate something that would be, you know, have the pretend to make reference to a certain financial actions, and even less as a satire. I mean, and not only that it's a satire, but it's a family drama, as I will speak later. So it is framed as a period film. It is set in the 1980s, which by now are 20-something years ago. And it is framed as the times when we got greedy, when the British financial system is Americanized, and of course in the film it is still resisting because it has some strong ethical fiduciary values. I will not get into the details about the film because we don't have time about it, but you have to trust me on this, that this setting in the past and this kind of framing of the film and tagging it as a period film generates a relativizing and distancing effect that doesn't have the immediacy that people felt, let's say, when you still watch, I mean, at least me, when I still watch The Big Short, and I still get angry when I see that film. On the other hand, even more interesting, it is framed as a family drama. And what does that mean? Well, that means on the one hand, we have the work versus family conflict, and the story is more about, you know, a banker who is greedy, and his greed is detrimental to the family. It also humanizes the banker because it's just a hubris of another, let's say, human being, a corporate actor who, you know, tries to make more money and this kind of perverts his life. But of course, in the end, with the help of the family, he realizes it and returns to the values. Also, what is interesting here in the film is that finance is just another corporate job. So what I would call a process, I don't have time to elaborate here, but what I would call a process of normalization of finance. Finance doesn't stand out as that kind of, financial services don't stand out as this kind of sector prone to cheating, to crime, to fraud, to scamming and other people's money. And this also, because it's so more focused on the family, the office insights are rather secondary. I mean, not that you don't learn anything about finance, but it's not even speaks much about, let's say, what's happening in a bank in a relevant and, let's say, critical way. So we can see the softening or the positivization that on the one hand, that the finance film is not approached anymore as critical finance directly, but more as, okay, let's remember a period of, let's say, deregulation, if you want to, and also, but through the framework of a family drama, right? And why is being done this? Because, and this tells something about the audiences as well, because being framed as a family drama, you think that, okay, perhaps audiences would not buy a straightforward finance film, or a film that the type of The Big Short anymore, but we have to lure them into a story with different triggers. All right. Okay, so I think this is the producer's contribution to the way in which they expand the archive, and the way in which it is being also re-envisioned and revisited. The second, and I would not talk about this because it's very evident, this is a screen from Amazon, typing Wall Street film. And I will not talk about much because the screen is not extremely relevant, but it is obvious that the curation on the site of a vendor is informed by sales interests. It gets more interesting for understanding the way in which audiences relate to film when we talk about curation on a stream, which also has an algorithm which recommends film according to big data, according to statistics, according to what you have watched before, which is not necessarily the case with this screen, because I use the Virgin screen, you know, the one that has not been used before. So, but maybe, you know, it knows the IPA, so whatever. Anyway, you can see a screen here. You can see the search. It was Wall Street, and then the screen showed these thumbnails. Okay, I will just go quickly through them. So the Wolf of Wall Street, Bitcoin explained, or money explained, the Big Short, Inside Job, The Social Network, Catch Me If You Can. I emphasize the ones that are not straightforward finance films, like All the Money in the World, The Gentleman, The Founder, Devil's Advocate, Brad Pitt, Moneyball, please buy Michael Lewis, the book, The Laundromat, yes, 21, Imitation Game, Hustlers to a certain extent, Dirty Money, Scarface, Limitless to a certain extent, Rising High, these not anymore, right? A Beautiful Mind, I forgot the title of the film, yeah, so, and Top Gun, Evil West, and Spycraft. Good. So I read through this because when I go on the next slide, we try to remember it. Now, let's see why is it interesting with Netflix? Because Netflix, the way it tags film, it also shows, it's a bit of the same demonstration as when I was talking about the Nest, that the films are rearranged according to, let's say, or they might be arranged according to people's interests. They show how audiences are approaching finance film in the present, or at least they give us a glimpse. It's not like the ultimate demonstration, but at least we have some sort of representation we can envision in a way this is happening. And what we see here, well, and indeed, so I'm talking about the thumbnails now. What we see here from 1 to 6 are the films on the previous screen categorized in, let's say, certain types of films. So on the other hand, we have the Wall Street film, right? Okay, like The Big Short, or like the Wolf of Wall Street. But then interest in the Wolf of Wall Street is also according to actor tags. Let's start from the bottom, right? Okay, I don't want to see a finance film. I want to see a Leonardo DiCaprio film, perhaps a comedy, you know. So you access the archive along this tag. Then literacy film, right? Well, I want to see The Big Short, or I want to see The Wolf of Wall Street. But the interest in it is not because it's criticizing the crime of 2008. No, often people want to watch a Wall Street film because they want to learn about finance. They want to learn about how to short the housing market, or how to deal in pink sheets, or whatever other scams or whatever other elements of finance you can learn from a finance film. There are, of course, the smart guy math whiz thrillers, right? Such as, to a certain extent, the Big Short has this element, but there are others here. And again, we like this kind of more cerebral. We only want to have this kind of nerd, smart, turning into rich person, smart person. Okay, so we can approach the finance film from that perspective, not again as not as critical of the 2008 crimes. Then, of course, the entrepreneur film, the same argument here. Now we have the Social Network, or the movie about the founder of McDonald's, and so on and so forth. So there are more of them. Company biopic is the same thing. So again, we approached finance film from this angle, and definitely as a hustler, conman, scam film, definitely the Wolf of Wall Street would qualify for that, and many others, like even more recently, like the Bernie Madoff, the miniseries and the film with starring Robert De Niro. So also from that point of view. So what we have here, and I kind of wrote this list here indicates an alternative branding of finance films and tagging of the archive from different angles. And with the assumption that it influences the way in which we think about them. Good. Then let's move to the next actor, which is the Google search. I mean, you want to see a finance film. I typed there finance movies. I could have typed Wall Street movies, etc. And then it's actually almost automatic. It's almost like a cause and effect link. Every time I'm sorry, my computer wants to restart. Just a second. So I don't press the wrong button and you lose me, right? So, okay, so if you go on Google and on any search engine, what you type, if you type finance movies or finance film or whatever, you end up being on your first screen, these kind of lists. So it's not our academic contributions, right? It's exactly the other, the aggregators, the simplifiers, the high traffic websites that show up. Okay, so you can see Investopedia in first place, 300 hours, because that's why I quoted them before. Also Liberated Stock Trader, which I will talk. So in a way, the Google is commercially interesting because these sites obviously are high traffic sites, so they show up. But Google algorithm also takes some money, and sometimes you have visibility because you pay. So and direct viewers, right? Okay, so again, commercial interest here as well. And now also an interesting discussion is when we click on these must-watch movie recommendations on these various, and there's many of them even on YouTube, and it's not only on textual, not only on text. I even found like podcasts that you can download. So let's see, this is the last one here, like a Liberated Stock Trader. And I have a few more, so I have 3. I will also give you a screen with Investopedia. So what we have here? Well, we have here, it's that the archive of finance film is being, of course, again, commercial interests, but here you can see it evidently. I mean, here on the left-hand side, you have the list. Well, there was not room for it on the screen. So you have the list here, and if you scroll down, you will have the whole 22 films with comments and also like a little commentary for each. But on the other hand, you have the ad. So the finance film here serves pretty much to sell this ad on the left hand, which, and I will come back to this. In this particular case, I mean, it could have, something else could have popped up, but in this particular case is investing lessons, as you can see here, right? No email required, join 348. Okay, this is a investment site, and you can tell it just by that little arrow over there. And you can see how the archival film is being used here. Now, also on must-see list, and this is StashLearn. This is another very popular site, also like a site that claims to empower people to invest, to learn how it's so the type of kind of eToro type, but less popular. So I mean, less popular in Europe. And again, the list, what we have here is the list, and the list, if you read here, the text, like the introduction to the, it highlights the entertainment value of the film as being an exciting to watch on the one hand, also as films about Wall Street that have won Academy Awards, so you're going to see an entertaining and quality film on the one hand. They present finance as exciting, if you look here, and also this also like these two aspects also soften the critical edge of the film, because we're going to watch an entertaining quality film, and with good interpretations by Oscar awarded actors and so on. And also, like another insight, which I think is the most also the most interesting one, and which is a little related to this whole concept of the dialectic of the Enlightenment, where you're being educated in something that becomes a repressive tool. So education starts working against you, because as we know, social investing, 95% of the people who practice social investing lose money. You lose more money than you lose on if you go on normal betting, or if you just play in a casino. So what is here, and this is Investopedia and all this site as well, because this stash is the list goes on Stash Learn, where you learn about how to invest, learn about the stock market. So on Investopedia, viewing is regarded as an investment in your career. I mean, why would you watch The Big Short? As it was quoted in the beginning, if you remember, you watch it because you want to learn how to invest against the, how to, be against the grain and make a lot of money. That's why you watch The Big Short. Why do you watch Barbarians at the Gate? Because you will watch it because it tells you about mergers and acquisitions. Or why would you watch Boiler Room? Because it tells you, about how to make a good sale. Or the same thing about the Wolf of Wall Street, and so on. And this is in a way what I call the Michael Lewis paradox. And you probably know in the introduction, maybe I've repeated this for some, in the introduction to The Big Short, the book. Now he writes about the impact of his previous book, which was Liar's Poker, the famous best-selling book. And what he says there is the typical quote that I've wrote a book that was critical of Wall Street, and the thing I got was millions of letters asking me to write another book so that people will be more initiated into Wall Street and have a career on Wall Street thanks to my critical intervention, right? So this is in a way because this is an early book from 1989, Liar's Poker. In a way, I think that's why I gave it its name. So I think I'm almost close to. So I'm almost close here to my conclusions. And those will be what? Well, pretty much repeating what I said in the beginning. Okay, you can sense the positivization of the message that, in a way, these sites, of course, they are interested in selling. So in a way, it's always positive sales better. On the other hand, they're interested in traffic, but they also interested in catering to a certain audience. And that audience often is an audience not that wants to learn about the crime, financial crime, or about finance as this kind of industry that has a certain hazard related to it. And again, the comparison to war films, I think, is we should always keep it in mind. Yes, we do not go to see a war film in order to learn how, a Holocaust film in order to, learn how to, perpetrate the same issues, but we learn there for, our ethical and for ethical reasons and for become better people. Same thing about a Vietnam film. We don't watch a Vietnam film to learn how to kill people in the jungle, but for other reasons, to see how terrible war is and how to avoid these kind of situations, and how it dehumanizes ourselves. when we participate there. So anyway, positivization on the one hand, so deflecting, relativizing the meaning by means of curation. And in this idea of the Michael Lewis paradox, satires and corporate crime films become, as they are revisited and presented on this website, they have their presentation is being positivized, and they're presented as period dramas and as instruments that teach aspirant investors the tricks of the trade. And indeed, this is why I insisted on The Nest, because films like The Nest, you know, as of course there is, as I was saying, this kind of historical entropy, but these films also give you the impression that, okay, this happened in the past. The 2008 crisis and recession, you know, are an event in the past that will not repeat itself. Although every time when it happens again and again, we will say, you know, we know it's going to repeat itself. But now that it's, you know, 12 years past, we focus on other issues because other issues are now on the agenda or in the headlines. So 2008 crisis and recession are less employed as frameworks of interpretation, but the ones that I was telling before, all the tags that I was mentioning before when I was talking about the Nest, or what you saw diagonally when you see how the way in which the finance film is associated with other types of film along, let's say, the big data, Netflix tags. And this instrumentalization of the content, yeah, films is exciting. People want to have film. We want to be in the buzz. And many commercial actors, and especially, as said, the ones who are the principal administrators are these aggregators, PR websites of financial, sites that offer you access to investing online, like Stash and like Liberty Stock Trader. So these are the most important commentators these days in the digital public sphere, with their lists of finance film. And of course, it's instrumentalized of content by commercial actors with evidently commercial interests. So I think I should stop here. Also, my time, I think, is up. If I look at the, yeah, I'm perfect. Of course, Dr. King, or I mean, we can talk more about issues in the Q&A, including the concept of profanation if you want to, but I mean, it's optional. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will unshare my slides.
Thank you very much, Constantin, for your very interesting talk. And now I will give the word to Alasdair King for his comments on this talk, and also, I guess, on the relation between cinema and finance. And thank you, Alasdair, for being here today with us.
Thank you. Let me just check I'm unmuted. I think I am, so that's great. Okay. I don't have any slides. I'm going to just kind of read my thoughts that I've been working on. So, but first, before I start, I just wanted to thank Constantin for asking me to be part of this exciting event and to nominate me with typical generosity to try to fill this role of discussant of what's been a really, I think, a really interesting and invigorating paper. And I'd also really like to thank Emiliano for welcoming me to the event and for hosting this meeting of finance. And I wanted to mention that as someone who initially found it quite a solitary scholarly task to be naively fascinated by the relationship between films and moving images and the movements and circulations of finance, as I was back a few years, it's really still genuinely exciting for me to be able to participate in this ongoing forum and networks like this. I think the links that such structures can find or produce between philosophy, in this case, and finance are really of great significance and generative across a number of research fields. So before I start, thank you to Constantin, thank you to Emiliano. And what I wanted to do was to respond to this great paper by just offering a short number of points. And in some cases, my points are questions. So what I'm going to speak on is 10 points on Constantine's Afterlives of Finance film. So point one then, it's exciting, I think, for me as a reader to see how Constantine's work on the finance film has developed in the direction it's taken today. As we've mentioned, the edited collection that he put out in 2018, Global Finance on Screen, that came out with Routledge, is groundbreaking, and for someone like me working out of the discipline of film, it's the go-to volume on the finance film. As I wrote when I first read the manuscript in support of the book, it's a book that's, to quote myself, acutely aware of how cinema helps to shape and inform popular opinion and understanding. And the writers here argue that recent finance films offer us a crucial sphere for reflection on the economic state that we're in and show us routes to forms of critical intervention in the name of economic and social justice. I said, this collection makes essential reading for anyone concerned with understanding how we have come to explain the contemporary financial sector to ourselves. And I finished by saying Global Finance on Screen will be indispensable to anyone wanting to make sense of contemporary capitalism and of the stories we tell about it, at the end of the quote. And I kind of stand by those comments very much. And also, I feel like they're kind of reinforced by the way that Constantine's approached this problem today. The paper fully extends these ideas, I think, of the ways that cinema shapes popular opinion, or it has the potential to shape popular opinion, and of the finance film's potential to support routes to critical intervention in the name of economic and social justice. This is so important, it's quite easy to forget this. And he's also correct to suggest that we don't seem to be in the high point of the mainstream finance film right now. So point two, what really is the nature of the finance film, and what's its relationship to general questions about visibility and the representation of the workings of finance capital? Do we have today in Constantine's paper something of a double crisis? So a double coming to visibility. And I'm going to explain what's quite a vague remark, I think. Could we say, would we agree that the finance film appears at a point where we no longer take for granted the invisible hand of the market or the invisible machine of accumulation and circulation that constitutes finance? Does the finance film respond to the point at which finance hits a crisis, and so its workings needed in 2007, 2008 and onwards to be made visible and sensible to a lay audience? Does this explain the timing and success of films in that great run up to things like The Big Short in 2015? Is it because we could no longer take the complicated world of financial transactions for granted, because finance had started to allow itself to become visible for such a great number of people? And I obviously want to make the caveat that those worst off socially have always known, it's always been visible to them, about precarity and debt. So in our everyday lives in 2007, 2008, and the following crisis, what's so-called global financial crisis, finance was rendered suddenly doubly visible in everyday life and in mainstream representation. So we might say that the finance film registers the moment when the circulation of capital hits a crisis and is frozen, and it's therefore visible. The point at which finance has to be narrated, explained, made sense of politically and ethically, debated. Okay, so point three then, following from this, is there a similar crisis of kind with the finance film itself, where its own circulation, production, distribution, reception, its participation in public debates, and its contribution to a critical public sphere has itself become somewhat frozen, for the very reason that Constantine articulates so well, I think. And this freezing itself becomes visible, as Constantine's shown us, and itself becomes narrated, explained, made sense of politically and ethically, and debated. The crisis that Constantine explores, does this relate to a frozen circulation of moving images? So the archive that we desire, one that's constantly growing, adapting, redrawing its lines of inquiry, appears right now to be too static, too subject to the control of capital itself, as we've heard. Although, again, a caveat, we know that producing a major finance film has always been a huge task of investment of all kinds. So point four, Constantine's notion of the archive here, I think, is truly helpful. It gives us a methodology that's not constrained by or limited to the interpretation of individual films. Instead, it asks us to think of how existing finance films are consumed, how that consumption is controlled and regulated by now clearly financial interests that deploy weighted algorithms to produce certain priorities and to foreground certain films. In a sense, this kind of guided consumption that seeks to positivize and render harmless destructive investment strategies and even criminal behavior on the part of finances, this has been with us perhaps as long as we've had the finance film. And it makes me think of an example that when The Wolf of Wall Street was released in London, and adverts for the film were on the side of buses and on billboards at our tube stations, the prime advertising sites chosen seemed to be in and adjacent to the City of London and Canary Wharf, which are obviously London's financial hubs. What does that tell us? It seemed that this major film, The Wolf of Wall Street, was both participating and contributing to the public sphere, but also part of its promotion even then was the invitation to bankers to come to see tales of one of their own, and not out of a gesture of contrition or admonition. Indeed, banks organised, they rented cinemas and they organised private screenings of the film for all their employees, and they fostered a celebratory atmosphere as the tales of criminal excess were shown on screen. So point 5, we can see how this archive that Constantin describes so well, it's both a material collection of images and statements, performances and experiences, explanations and retributions, and at the same time, something that gets accessed now through quite weighted and perhaps anti-public mechanisms, in the sense they're not necessarily opening up the public sphere. So anti-public mechanisms such as Netflix, Google, and Investopedia. But is the archive static and complete? Is it a closed collection? Constantin suggests not with some of his examples, and here I'd agree with his compelling argument. There do seem to be new and in several cases successful mainstream additions to the finance film archive, but how do we make sense of them? Because they seem a little different from what's come before. The two, when I knew I was responding to Constantin's talk, and I wasn't quite sure the route that the talk would take, the two newish texts, films, media events that came to my mind were Billions, which is a US drama TV series that premiered on Showtime in January 2016, and which has produced 6 complete seasons so far. And again, a very recent program called Inventing Anna, which is a US miniseries created and produced by the mega mainstream producer, Shonda Rhimes, that was released via Netflix in February 2022. And both films, if we can accept them as such, given their moving image drama narratives, seem to me to be contributing to the archive in significant ways that both add support to Constantin's argument and also offer up some questions for us. So point 6, let me talk a little bit about Billions. It's set directly in the world of high finance, based it is largely in the headquarters of 2 extremely successful hedge funds. And it also takes place in the offices of the district attorneys and the regulators seeking to prosecute corruption and malpractice. The series sets up dramatic conflicts, mostly involving the main hedge fund manager, Bobby Axelrod, and the leading attorney, Chuck Rhodes. And the third person in the kind of triumvirate is Rhodes' wife, Wendy, as she's a prominent employee at Axelrod's Axe Capital, where she uses her medical training in psychology to act as a performance coach to Axe and his team. And she's extremely close to Axe. She's worked with him for years and years. For somebody that's interested in finance and moving images, I have to confess I'm very late to watching Billions, so please no spoilers in the discussions. I'm kind of ending the 4th series right now. But I find it significant, both in the way that plot lines are drawn from real life events and trials involving Wall Street and associated corporations over the 90s and 2000s. So in this way, it reworks the archive that Constantin addresses as part of its own textual fabric. And it's also characterized by deep cine literacy on the part of its protagonists, who quote lines and scenarios from their favorite films, which come from all genres and not constrained to the finance film genre. This makes me think of the communal film viewing scene in Boiler Room, by the way. In terms of the questions that Constantin raises, Billions seems to argue that the conflict between hedge fund managers pushing the boundaries of legality and the regulators is less of an ethical dilemma, where economic and social justice have clear contours, and instead what we're finding is more of a will to power between protagonists. and the protagonists often mirror each other in terms of their motivation and their willingness to act illegally. This Billions is both compelling, I think, in viewing, and equally depressing in this way, although it is interesting in the way that it's registers gender and gender identity, I think. But I do think that that Billions bears out the point that Constantine's making, that we're no longer seeing a critical intervention into the world of finance in the way that we were a decade or so ago. That seemed to be the trajectory right at the very start, when you had a very clear and strong district attorney in New York who's hunting down malpractice. But that route became one that ran out of steam really early on in the first series, I think, and subsequent seasons have not continued that. Point 7, questions of identity are certainly foregrounded, albeit in a different way, in Inventing Anna, which has so far had a mixed critical reception, but which I found kind of involving. Inventing Anna is also based, here absolutely centrally, on real life events, on the story of Anna Sorokin, and a long feature expose about her in New York Magazine, which was called How Anna Delvey Tricked New York's Party People. The show sets out how the Russian-born Anna Sorokin passed herself off as German heiress Anna Delvey and persuaded New York's Phinance and Glitterati to back her plan for an exclusive club and gallery complex. And Anna builds over, I think, maybe 8 episodes, a specific image and backstory, and importantly, and quite brilliantly at times, leverages this into accruing a series of investments and luxury services. So point 8, Inventing Anna revolves around questions of identity and of accessing the real. Anna's true identity is in doubt for much of the miniseries. But the show, I think, also challenges our understanding of the boundaries of the finance film. Is the finance film specifically centered on the internal workings of the corporate sector in Wall Street and the City of London and Frankfurt and various other important financial hubs across our continents? Hubs from which we as viewers of these films are placed in a position where we stand at some remove and we cast ethical judgment from a safe distance. At what point when we're thinking about the finance film must we acknowledge, and here I think we would be following Randy Martin and others, that the financial sector does not stand apart from us, but we all stand within a process we might see, as Randy Martin says, as the financialization of everyday life. Does this necessitate a widening of what we might consider the finance film? So point 9, and if so, if this is the case, doesn't something like Inventing Anna take us into just those modes of speculation, investment, and self-valorization? By that I mean where we seek to maximize our financial capital through various kinds of investments and leverages. These processes which are demanded of many of us across many aspects of our everyday working life. If the ascendancy of finance capital marks out a world in which circulation is foregrounded over production, and if speculation itself becomes a main mode of production, then a narrative like Inventing Anna, where we might seek out the trajectories of the finance film. And in this case, must we take into account that in the 2020s, we are less Wall Street, and if decisively not quite in Anna's case, Main Street or even Side Street, as named in the title of Global Finance on Screen, but we are somewhere else spatially and in terms of experiences. So to conclude then with these questions, in point 10, these afterlives that Constantine's exploring and has shared with us today are not the traces of something I think that's no longer happening and only belongs to history. They are after images of a fascinating kind, as Constantine has argued, I think. As one of the economists wrote, quote, "In the long run, we are all dead," end of quote. But the finance film, as we've seen, isn't dead and buried in an archive, but it's living and mutating, both in its own new forms and by way of the questions that Constantine and researchers following his lead are posing of images that we thought we knew and had experienced at a certain time and in a certain place. To end, I'd say these afterlives constitute, it seems to me, the finance film's present and future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alasdair, for your comments, and I think now we can open the debate. And unless Constantin has something to say about your comments or your points, and then in that case,
to thank you for I just wanted just to say thanks and for making me understand better my own presentation and also rendering into like more some concepts that are definitely smarter, and I wrote down so many issues, and I can tell like from 1.1 to 0.10 that I wrote. These are of course all topics of research and investigation, and yeah, so thank you, very interesting.
Okay, so I think we can open the debate, and if there are questions from the audience, now it's time to pose them. And of course, I have questions, but I think it's better if the other people break the ice.
Okay, I'll jump in if you like.
Okay, thank you.
Just one or two thoughts. The first is, if I go back to Constantine's list that came under the heading Genre Wall Street, and you missed out, and you told us that you were going to miss out. Oh, no, it's not that one. But anyway, you told us you were going to miss out the last category of activists, critics, etc. Right? And what occurred to me was that they actually belong to the circuits that you're describing, perhaps in ever decreasing circles, because the movies are what set the agenda for a lot of certainly in the mainstream media, but also in the social media and academic circles and so on. There's a huge amount of agenda setting that the movies achieve. And of course, the role of the critics in the mainstream media is very central to that. The other thing is, Alasdair, I very much appreciated your 10 points. And it occurred to me that a couple of them translated into another sort of a theoretical vocabulary would provide very useful kind of strands of investigation. And one of them is to talk about recuperation, which actually seems to me to be the trajectory that Constantine is describing. And another would be to talk about, and this is on the level of the textual analysis of individual films, but to talk about intertextuality. And that would lead into all sorts of interesting areas. I suppose those are the two main things that come to mind for me. I wonder how both of you feel about those.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your thoughts and comments. And now I think that Constantin Alasdair can answer.
Sure, I agree. So the first thing I would say is I agree with your comments, and indeed, the first one is that yeah, I have looked at the way in which films have been reviewed, and this is a different genre, because the genre of reviewing is also sometimes it's not necessarily related to the, so to say, to the text of the film itself. I mean, reviewers are writing, interpreting along certain lines, various types of films, so not necessarily only these corporate dramas or this financial crime films of those of the year. So I can just agree, and I'll let Alasdair reply to the second one, which was a bit more comment on his intervention.
Okay, thanks, Constantine, and thank you, Michael. Yeah, those are really interesting points, I think, and made me think to go back to some of the thoughts I had when I was trying to prepare a condensed 10-point kind of thing. Recuperation, it's such a great word, and thank you for sharing that with us today. I don't think it's in my talk, and certainly perhaps not in Constantine's either, but it absolutely hits things centrally. What's going on with recuperation here with these particular finances that are depicted? And it made me think of, I haven't done any research yet on billions or inventing Anna, although I will, but it made me think of something that really struck me about billions, that there is a foundational event, right? For sensitive reasons, I call it a ground zero event, which is a historic event, which is referred back to delineate the contours of Axelrod's financial actions. And fascinatingly, it's not 2007, 2008, it's 9/11. Okay, so he suddenly becomes rich because he's not in the towers at the point that the planes hit and destroy the company for which he works. And he's not there because he's having to attend a malpractice hearing outside the towers. So that gets him out of that location. And he survives, and immediately, as a young broker who's prepared to break every rule, he senses an opportunity out of that political chaos. So a lot of the backstory is the version of America that the film is giving to us, and it's one that tries to align his kind of incredibly libertarian financial dealings with a rebuilding after 9/11, rather than a rethinking of the role of finance after 2007. And I think that idea of recuperation in terms of the way that narrative works is fascinating. And I'm sure as I give that more thought, that will come into it. It's a really interesting nationalist or national American story in that sense. And the other one you talked about, the other one you mentioned is intertextuality. And I think you're absolutely right. Constantine knows these films better than I do, and the amount of citation, quotation, reference to movies within the films we're looking at, reference to music, the linking up of music, etc. The way that these films are themselves already media collages, and are becoming even more so, is, I think, really very, very, very interesting. They're self-aware at the same time as they're very mainstream. So both are really important points. Thank you, and make me think further on this one.
Thank you, Alasdair. I have a question for both of you, and thinking about this archive that you are describing and also evolving. And so my question is probably about the next future. So what do you think is missing in this archive right now, in the sense that what kind of movie would you like to be produced and to be watched, and that is not being produced in a way that is really extending the archive? I don't know if I'm enough clear, but
I think it's very, very clear, but that's a very difficult question to answer. At least I feel like, okay, I definitely would like to. To have the feeling that the 2000 that when you revisit the archive, that 2008 is not forgotten. That somehow it still remains a framework of interpretation, and that if you see films that somehow they still point out the hazardous aspect that is specific of a business. If you do a film of that type, if you deal with banks, but if you do banks and you just use the bank as a background for a family drama, that is a bit of a problem. So you would think like, okay, I don't want to. So why it's difficult for me, because in the way I'm critical of the literacy aspect of these films. So, okay, you watch the films, whether it's fiction or documentary, and it teaches you about the finance industry, and you would say, okay, so this is a bit of a, as I was mentioning before, perverted knowledge, in the sense that, okay, you learn, but then why do you need to use this? How do you use this knowledge, and so on and so forth. So, but on the other hand, the literacy aspect is positive, is a good thing, as long as it is also critical, right? So you would expect these components in these particular films. On the other hand, but this is very complicated, because like two things, like, which have been pointed by Alasdair as well. Like, on the other hand, the visibility issue, like how the focus, like where is the focus? Is just something in the background, or is it like visible, and then the perspective is, the angle is of such nature that indeed you have a good critical understanding of the phenomenon. If that's happening, of course, it still has to be entertaining and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there is this idea of like a financiarization. So, okay, and we pointed out this in the collection, because there, as finance film, we included a film that was, about people who lost their homes because of the mortgages and so on. So because they were tricked by lenders, so that would qualify, or evictions. So that would qualify also in this broader context of the way in which financial speculation or fraud, or whatever you want to call it, has impacted society. So, but then one step further, I would say that, okay, financiarization, so how do you track that? I mean, you understand that, of course, there is all these theories about neoliberalism, the way in which, like Wendy Brown, which you talk about yourself as everything you do, you consider it as an investment, like you perceive yourself as an investment machine and as the object of your investment. So all your many of your actions, social, cultural, even personal actions, are understood in the line of financialization as being an act of investment. That's more linked to, let's say, a critique of neoliberalism. But I think that, yes, indeed, films that will trace this type of, and perhaps the Nest, to a certain extent, would qualify as one, although not necessarily, but films that indeed trace not only that show what happens in the trading room or headquarters of the banks, but also films that you have the feeling when you watch it that they would fall rather in, so that, but with the reserve that some of them would fall, people would just say, okay, so this is a film about neoliberalism or capitalism, the way in which it informs your everyday life and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure if you can really draw the line and separate it from this type of film. But yeah, I think these two directions I can see. I would like to see a film made. Yeah, but an eviction film still works. Why not?
That's correct. That sounds great. If I can give my answer to that one about the archive. Yeah, I'm not muted. Constantine was smile about this, because I talked about this film, or these films, when we last met in person in Poland a couple of years ago. One of the first films I was interested in when I started to think about this area was a German film called Yella by Christian Petzold, who's since become really quite a famous director, and maybe one of the leading European directors, I guess, and made some incredible films. And Petzold's film was a ghost story, which thinks about finance and investment banking in a really interesting way, which uses a generic approach that maybe one wouldn't anticipate. And some of his ideas there about finance is haunting, and money, and how the future plays out in the present, etc., and the ghost, the spectrality of finance, he realizes really well in what's quite a mainstream kind of generic mode. So more films like that. I'd love more films like that. I find them quite hard to come across. So Yella sent me looking at what was Petzold's inspiration for his own film, and he worked at that point very closely with the essayist the filmmaker and essayist Harun Farocki. And Farocki's own films, which look at finance, I found really exciting, and that led me to think that maybe there's also a parallel archive going on in what we variously call artist moving image or expanded cinema, films that might be shown in the gallery, for example, rather than on the mainstream cinema screen. So a very different kind of public and a very different kind of public sphere, perhaps. And I feel like there's a lot going on there which links up philosophy of finance and various kinds of visual practice, which I'm finding really challenging for my own, not necessarily coming from an art background, but also really, really rich. So I guess it's not becoming impatient with the state of mainstream cinema when it seems to not be providing as interesting films as, say, The Big Short, which I also agree is really, really exciting. And trying to investigate around the margins a bit more, and just hoping somebody incredibly talented will be able to bring these things together in a more mainstream and accessible film, I think.
Okay, thank you, Constantin Alasdair. And yes, that's those are interesting answers, and yeah, those let me think of also maybe a kind of critical appraisal of a few movies about finance, in the sense that most of them are exciting, and especially the ones, those depicting the crisis, the 2008 crisis, and yes, and they also are enough accurate, I would say, in the sense that the financial mechanisms that are represented are accurate and actually occurred. Maybe the problem is when a few films, a few movies try to oversimplify the financial processes, in the sense that finance at the end is an easy target, and it's the enemy. It's in a sense is the old white man, and that has to be defeated that it is also a bad man also, most of the time, and so that's an easy target. But we also have to recognize that financial systems are an essential and vital part of our society. I mean, the Western societies. So I think that it's hard to balance all these two aspects when you're trying to representing finance in a movie, in the sense that finance is not always or most of the time bad, but the movies that are appealing are those that depict finance in that way, and that's and maybe that could be a problem, in the sense that those movies shape the public opinion and the way finance is perceived, and so and that could push us to reject financial mechanisms and systems also when they are not so bad or simply bad or evil. I don't know if
yeah,
that's a question.
I can reply to this. I mean, let us put it this: these are like moving images, okay, films. There is, let's imagine that, you know, there is the internet is kind of this enormous now meta archive or super archive, not the archive that we're talking about here, which is, you know, full of commercials of banks, and, you know, where they present their financial instruments, and the good banker that, you know, you have a great idea, you know, like this kind of Morgan Stanley commercials that you have, like, okay, you have a great idea, then comes Morgan Stanley banker and he gives you the money, and the next thing you know, you have put your kids through school, you have saved the community from pollution, whatever, you know, you understand the story, right? So there is like movies they're just like very small, you know, like a very small material in this kind of enormous archive, which is dominated by commercials, by interviews. Go on Bloomberg, go on, where on television, where there's so much advertising and so much promotion of everything that you were talking about. We're not against, I mean, even if you're not against, I mean, I'm not against banks. I don't want to like, you know, I'm not proposing anything to cancel or nationalization. I mean, maybe we can talk about nationalization, but we can, I mean, not necessarily like I would, you know, I understand that, I mean, I respect it and everything, but I'm just saying that this is just about this little form of art, which is public film as public art, you know, like, you know, like working, I mean, struggling against, now it's like a David versus Goliath fight, you know? So we're just, I mean, the way I see it here, I'm just supporting the resistance, which I think is good in a democratic, you know, society. That's our point, not to tear down the bank, right? So, yeah.
Can I throw something in here?
Yes, of course.
This is just a kind of thinking out loud in response to this conversation. I think the first thing I would want to say, and I want to bring it back to the question of cinematic texts, if you like. The first thing is that I don't think genre cinema is at all capable of doing the kinds of things we would like it to do. I think it's impossible in genre cinema. But the analysis of the kinds of things that we've been talking about leads me to think in a slightly different direction. I've recently done a study of the development of another genre, the musical biopic. And if you compare the biopics of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and so on and so forth, right? The first thing is that you can't grasp them, as the genre develops, you can't grasp them in any way according to the normal kind of classical conventions of genre analysis that apply to genres like the Western, because they don't have a consistent iconography of any kind. They can't have a consistent iconography of any kind. Some of them are historical pics, some of them are romantic pics. Most of them come from musicals, which have their own generic rules, and so on and so forth. And then I compared 4 films about Billie Holiday. 2 of them fiction and 2 of them documentary. Now, the nature of a biopic is that it can only be constructed out of archival material, plus imagination, obviously. All of them, without exception, are always accused of being historically incorrect. All of them, without exception, have to simplify. But there's a difference in the treatment of the archive between the fiction films and the documentary films, because the documentary films can call up the archive directly, right? So what you have is a big puzzle about the breakdown of the nature of genre. Yeah? And when you add into that to understand the difference between, you know, the first of those Billie Holiday fiction movies and the most recent, there's a clear change in the historical perspective. Because the second one has to admit to things that the first one had to suppress. Yeah? And the same thing goes on with documentary. If you turn that back to the question of the Phinance film, then I think you'll find the same kind of generic puzzles. And then out of the back of my mind comes one other idea, or one other memory, really. When I first saw a film of a completely different genre, John Huston's The Man Who Would Be King, I was absolutely convinced that what I was watching was a cinematic transcription of Marx's Dialectic of Gold. And that leads me to my final thought, which is that the elephant in the room, so to speak, is that there's a constant elision and tension between finance and capital, or the operations of neoliberal financialized capitalism and just good old-fashioned capitalism.
Can I respond? Well, actually, I don't know if I'm capable of responding because there's so many good points there. The very, very last point made me think of some of those incredible essays about the way that capitalism itself is an enemy of the markets. You know, current capitalism, finance capitalism, is actually an enemy of what might be usefully functioning, effective, what we might call freed markets. And it'll make me think of that and want to research that further. And you're talking about the Huston film, and Marx made me also think then about the failed Eisenstein film of Das Kapital, right? Which didn't come off, right? So even then, Eisenstein, who could do pretty much everything, realized he couldn't really do what Marx was doing with Das Kapital.
Didn't Farocki try and make?
He was certainly investigating it. I don't think he's obviously can't now, but I don't think they put it fully into effect. But it's an interesting passage. I mean, Kluger's recent film really investigated that. Yeah, the long Kluger works really tried to negotiate with that. But the point, the main point, I think, if I've understood you correctly, and maybe I haven't, about genre not being able to cope with finance, I think that's a conclusion I've found quite a lot in the work that I've done. It may be because of the films I've seen or the way I understand genre, but I kind of feel like genre, or the genres that we might use for finance, humanize so much what are both human and machinic processes of valuation, which involve all kinds of data, material, codes, numeric ways of understanding the world. And what we need is a kind of a way of using moving images, which has a more of a kind of mixed semiotic system. You talk about iconography with regard to the musical biopic, and I think it's to do with iconography too. I feel like maybe a successful film would be one that didn't just focus on white men in suits in offices, but brought in a different kind of sense of semiotic and representation. And that's quite hard to do at a mainstream genre level, I think. And it's something that independent filmmakers maybe will find more available to them, and certainly people working in the gallery find that they have the freedom to do so. I'm kind of looking in those directions now, and probably for my next book. So I kind of, unless I've misunderstood you completely, I kind of agree with you. What I just want to finish by saying, because just in case we run out, is I'm really sorry, but I've been summoned by my university to a really important meeting that I'll have to go for in a very short time, 2 minutes or so. So if I suddenly disappear, please excuse me and accept my apologies, but it's not of my own volition. It's to do with being part of an institution that desperately wants me to call in. So if I suddenly disappear from screen, thank you very much for a great afternoon.
Let me just throw in that something at the back of my mind is also saying that another alternative source for these things is Latin American cinema. I can't immediately think of an example, except that the title Nine Queens keeps entering the back of my mind.
Somebody's mentioned, I'm not an expert in that field whatsoever. My background's more German, but somebody's mentioned that to me before as being really, really interesting. So thanks for that.
If I think of anything else, I'll let you know.
That would be really kind. Thank you.
Well, the problem with the biopic that you were mentioned is that the Billie Holiday biopic that with the finance film is a bit different. It's the opposite. It's like, you know, the closer to the, say, the event of 2008, there were more things have been said. And now as time goes by, we say less and less. I mean, as I was talking before, it kind of gets out of focus, right? Or it gets relativized. So
Well,
yeah, it's interesting from that point of view.
It's kind of
Yeah,
ideological.
the genre here, genre needs to move on. They need to sell. They need to find ways of drawing audiences. And it's obvious that we live in a process where the 2007-2008 crisis is being forgotten. And I think it shouldn't be. It should be treated, well, not like a Holocaust, but definitely like a very important moment, like let's say 1989 or September 11. It should be treated like that. And I don't think that is happening. I mean, at least the way we see for cinematic production, looking for audiences, the way in which archive is being administrated, this is definitely not the trend.
Okay, thank you, Constantin, for this last remark. And yeah, I agree with you. And I don't know if there are other questions or subjects to be discussed. Or if there are no other questions, I think we can close our meeting here. And I would like to thank you for this interesting afternoon. And I have a lot of things to reflect on. And thank you very much, Alasdair, Constantin, also Michael. And I hope to see you soon on Phinance online seminars. And
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Bye. And I'll stop here the recording. Yes.
Good to see you all.